Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula, and we have the whole gang together for this episode where we're going to break down the most exciting first half in F1 fantasy history. Rob and Terry, how's your break going so far?
Yeah, things are going well, Adam. It's been a nice couple of weeks to disconnect. And yeah, I think I'm very much looking forward to ripping back into fantasy when things kick off in a couple of weeks' time.
For me, I wish it had been a nice couple of weeks of disconnect, but unfortunately the Formula One news cycle didn't get the memo about the summer break. So it's still been a bit busy, and I've been drowning in flat pack furniture, as I think I was this time last year when we had the same conversation actually with mid-season breaks and building flat pack furniture. It seems my wife has an agenda on that one, which we need to discuss for the end of the season, that's for sure.
And if anyone hasn't seen Terry's calendar, he keeps a daily run of whether we've been marked safe from any F1 news or if there's anything that we have to dive into. So keep an eye on that as the summer break unfolds. We're going to kick things off tonight by talking about the state of the game and how things have changed since 2023 before diving into some of the key stats from the first half. And then after that, Terry's going to lead us in talking about the most meaningful technical changes this season and wrap up with some of our predictions for the rest of the year. So, Rob, this has been a very different game since 2023, and the product on track has led to a much funner fantasy experience for all of us.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's been a huge swing in how the community has grown and developed this year, the interface of the game and the change to a couple of different chips as well has also made it a much more contentious, in terms of F1 fantasy decisions, approach to how we manage our teams. And so I think that's obviously a really encouraging sign. Even though the player base has not really changed year on year, the introduction of those featured leagues and the dynamic homepage has truly made it quite a fascinating game this season, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And I kind of like the dynamic homepage too, because it shows you how your team is doing race over race. If you have multiple teams, it lays out which chips you've used, and then it gives you a quick summary too of how you're doing in all of your mini leagues. So a really cool new feature for this year. And then also one of the things that's made it extra exciting is that we've had a breakthrough in the community on how price changes are determined in the game. So last year, it was the first 8 races. We didn't even see any meaningful price changes. And now we have the secret to how that formula is determined. And then we can predict the best drivers week in and week out, not only for points, but for cost cap gain too.
Yeah, I definitely think it's made the approach to our decisions much more dictated by whether or not a certain driver or constructor will go up in price and their performance as a result. And I think, we've been talking about this before, but even around how we build our teams and the structure of whether we run a couple of premium drivers or one premium driver with reliable C-tier assets has certainly made it for a much more diverse and varied team selection week to week.
Absolutely. And the first half has been a really exciting time for the fantasy formula as well. Rob mentioned the featured leagues a moment ago, and we're proud to host our own featured league with over 100,000 teams. So P1 in that league is Andrew, who we're going to see coming up in just a moment. His team is called Leaps Frog, and he's also an avid viewer of the show. We also hosted 3 amazing guests from F1 TV, Laura Winter, Chris McCarthy, and Alex Brundle. So they gave us some great insights on both the state of the grid and a little look at that fantasy smack talk that goes on the F1 TV set. So a great first half for us for sure.
Yeah, it's also made our deadline streams before qualifying really entertaining as well with all of these lineup submissions. I definitely think, Terry, there's been quite a few viewers that have lent on your technical input as to how they should develop their teams or build them out in each of the races.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There seems to be a few people sort of gathering with some strange requests for avocado toast amongst knowing what's going on with upgrades, but no, I think I've really enjoyed the deadline streams, and actually bringing the tech side of it I think it's really helped the game, helped the community, but it's also added I think another dimension to fantasy formula as well. So they've been really enjoyable, and the interaction on there from the community has been pretty amazing. Actually, we've had some really good streams. Not being able to keep up with the chat on a lot of them seems to be the biggest problem.
We had a shoey out of a boot. We had my Almave experience earlier in the year. We had our friends at Fifth Gear Garms with a big episode for the British Grand Prix where we gave away some great prizes, and our chat ended up picking their whole team, their lineup, and their team name. So we've had some really great live streams too, thanks to Terry, our special guests, and of course our sponsor, Fifth Gear Garms. So moving on now to Our Fantasy Formula League leaderboard. I mentioned Leapers 1 a moment ago. He has been on absolute fire this year. He's P2 in the Global League, and he avoided some of the mess of George Russell last time out at Spa, so he is still number 1 in this league. So congratulations to Andrew.
Yeah, I think he's in a really good spot to continue this momentum into the second half of the year. His budget is far ahead of where we have our teams, and I think he's got a very well set up lineup even for Zandvoort coming up. So Andrew's in a very envious position that a lot of us have work to do to catch up.
All right, let's dive now into some of the most meaningful statistics from the first half, starting with price gain. And this is something, now that we have the formula on how the price changes are determined, we can now take this data and harness it into picking the best drivers for cost cap growth. Rob, who stands out to you in some of the data we see here?
I mean, we can't talk about cost increases without mentioning Kevin Magnussen. He has been absolutely phenomenal this season, hasn't he? He was out of the blocks, 5 price increases of 0.5 million in the first 5 races. A bit of a mixed bag of results between Miami and Spain, but has bounced back since then, another 4 price increases in a row in the last 4. So he's got a lot of momentum. One of the lowest priced assets to start the season as well. So I think a very good sign for those who have stuck faithfully with K-Mag, and I think he's probably the biggest surprise to me. I definitely thought that the driver with the most overtakes and the most price increases would be a C-tier driver, but my money wasn't on the Dane at the start of the year.
Absolutely. And there's been this shift in the leaderboard in cost cap growth throughout the year. We had Ferrari really high in the leaderboard for the first 7 or 8 races. And then all of a sudden, with Mercedes and McLaren coming on strong, you can see over the last 5 races, it's Lewis and Oscar that leads the pack in cost cap growth. And I think they're going to be some of the hottest drivers in our lineups for the second half. And to put into perspective how hot they are right now, over the last 4 races, each of them have 80 championship points apiece, which is more than both Ferrari drivers or both Red Bull drivers. So I recommend both Hamilton and Piastri, not only for their points game, but their cost cap upside as well.
Terry, are there any surprises aside from maybe K-Mag that stand out to you in the price increase?
I think you've got the re-emergence of Alpine with Ocon in there as well, sneaking up there. Beginning of the season when they started, I'd say that was probably looking unlikely, I'd say, from their early season performance. But yeah, I mean, I didn't have K-Mag. I would have thought, naturally Hulkenberg would have been higher at that, actually, in terms of when you look at championship standings. And I think this is where the difference between the championship and the game come into it a bit, because actually, my head would say Hulkenberg would be a safer bet because he's performing better in terms of race results for Haas. But actually, in terms of the game and price increases, you've actually got the opposite with Kevin Magnussen. So for me, it's been a real eye-opener this season into how you play the game more than actually picking a team based on what they score in the Constructors and Drivers' Championships, to be honest.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that kind of dovetails nicely into the cost increases for the teams as well, because Haas are, again, one of the highest rising constructors in the game, and although they probably haven't attracted quite as much attention compared to the likes of Ferrari, Red Bull, Mercedes and McLaren throughout the year, they've obviously stamped their mark on the best C-tier constructor asset to own. I don't know about you guys, but RB for me in third place at 3.2 million since the start of the year does kind of stick out to me as one that I didn't expect to find.
I think for me with RB, they've really grown over these last 4 or 5 races, particularly as some of those early season upgrades have started dialing in. Daniel Ricciardo, in the previous data that we saw, he's gained 0.5 million in 5 of the last 6 races, and I think he's driving a lot of that growth. Yuki's been no slouch either, gaining 0.5 million in 3 of the last 5. So I think a lot of that RB growth has come in these last few races. And meanwhile, when we look at Ferrari, they had started the year with 8 straight price increases, including 2 $1 million gains. So it was a huge source of cost cap growth in the beginning of the season. But since that double DNF in Canada, they've come back to earth a little bit. So we're keeping an eye on Ferrari to see if they make that rise in the second half.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of optimism that they'll deliver some kind of package in the latter stages of the year that will kind of bring them back to the front. But it's yet to be seen what that looks like. And right now, Mercedes and McLaren are 2 of the most consistent performing premium constructors. So it's hard for me to move away from them at this point.
And for anybody seeing this data for the first time, I think we're at a point now where we'd recommend letting the drivers do the heavy lifting on cost cap growth and let your constructors accrue a ton of points. Unless Ferrari gets back in the game or Mercedes has a really big week, I wouldn't stick your neck out for Haas and V-Carb just for the sake of this cost cap growth. So heading down to the points now, those 7 wins earlier in the season propelled Max Verstappen to the top of the fantasy leaderboard, and he has the highest single score of the year. That was 58 points in his performance at the Chinese Sprint weekend. So guys, is there anything else from these total points that you can see here that really stand out to you?
I mean, I'll kick things off, but would love to get Terry's take on it as well. I think McLaren are the standout, as I just mentioned before, best value for money assets at the moment. They've definitely come a long way from the first few races where they were more or less also rans in the top 4, top 5 teams. But since those upgrades, since Lando's win in Miami, they've definitely appeared to be the best car on the grid. Max has certainly got his work cut out for him. I still think he's going to win the championship, but it will be a very competitive second half of the season, and it's certainly shown as well recently. Mercedes, although a little way down the order, have really come through in the last 4 or 5 races to stamp themselves in F1 fantasy essential territory.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I probably look towards more the bottom. Alex Albon being a disappointment this season. In terms of just overall performance from Williams. They've been a team which, we talk about them in terms of development, but haven't capitalised a lot at all this season. So they've been, quite sort of out there, and probably Stake as well. Their performance has been, a lot of people have unfortunately actually used them in terms of, making it the teams and the budget wise, but they've not really turned a corner at any point this season, despite sort of various promises and false starts. There's not been a single race where you could actually say they're beginning to make the right move forward, and second half of the season is probably looking pretty much the same for them. So definitely, and then going back to the rise of Lewis, certainly absolutely on the roll. Absolutely phenomenal last few races. He's been both fantasy and just driving, so it's going to make it interesting, that's for sure. And probably that Aston Martin one in the middle as well. Last season would have made a lot of teams. Looking at it this season, certainly not so much of a sure bet this year at all compared to what they probably were last year for a lot of people and a lot of teams.
Yeah, they're just in no man's land territory, aren't they? Because Stroll's a B tier asset, but getting C tier production, and Alonso's a B tier asset, but kind of in the middle between what the better B tier drivers are and the worst B tier drivers are and the better C tier drivers are. So I think all 3 of us have kind of covered them at various points this season. Probably avoids for the time being.
Yeah.
And when I look at this, there's 2 things that stand out to me. One is just the change, some of the biggest risers from 2023. Rob, earlier you mentioned Kevin Magnussen. He was P17 last year, but he's all the way up to P11 this year, so a big turnaround for him. And then you have Charles Leclerc, who went from P8 to P3 this year, Piastri from P9 to P4, and I think that's going to go even higher as the season goes on. So it's interesting seeing fresh blood at the top of the fantasy grid. And then when we look at some of these teammate battles, Tsunoda has nearly double the points of his teammate Daniel Ricciardo, while Ocon has exactly triple the total of Pierre Gasly, because Gasly's been bit by a few more DNFs. So really interesting to see how some of these teammate battles are shaping up as well. So moving now from the total points scored to the value, points per million, or as we call it in the game, PPM, you can see here the best drivers continue to deliver the best value. Max, the 2 Ferrari drivers, and the 2 McLarens at the top of our list here.
Yeah, I think Max's consistency stands out above the rest. The only major blemish this season was that DNF in Australia. He's had some inconsistent results, in Monaco, and then Hungary a little off the pace too. I think that's quite telling. Both tracks exhibit quite similar characteristics, but definitely the best performer. I know, Terry, you've carried him through most of the season this year, but you look kind of a little way down the order. It's very tight at the top between the Ferraris and the McLarens, and I think the Mercedes are probably a little under the radar there because they've definitely demonstrated a bit more value of late.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Max has been my go-to person for most of the season, to be honest, because you can almost bank on him delivering a performance, even if the car's not up to it. So I've probably used him more than I've used, Red Bull as a team asset. So I've been definitely all season a go-to Max sort of candidate, absolutely.
My eyes navigate all the way to the bottom there with Logan Sargent, because a lot of us have been running Sargent as an enabler for either a 2-tier B lineup or a Max and Red Bull lineup, and he's delivering so little value on a points basis. And we saw in the previous slide, he's on 10 straight races of cost cap decreases. It's very painful to run Logan, and you have to try to find that balance of getting the most out of him to enable these higher drivers, but also coming to terms with the fact that you'll have to have a low points upside and a cost cap loss each week.
Yeah, I think Logan, Zhou, even maybe Bottas all kind of sit within the same category, and Stake were much better earlier in the season, but they, again, just seem to be, in my opinion, more expensive Logan Sargents right now. So I think if you're looking for a couple of extra million to upgrade elsewhere in your team, Logan Sargent becomes an ideal replacement for one of the Stake guys, because there's just not anything we're seeing from Bottas or Zhou to suggest that they are that much better than Logie Bear.
It's interesting, right? The beginning of the season, they were both looking fast, but the pit stops were holding them back. Then they solved the pit stop issue, and then they tend to slow way down. So it's just been a rough first half for Stake, for sure.
They use the pit stop parts on the car and vice versa.
Well, that would certainly be interesting. And then moving on to Rob's favorite statistical category, driver of the day. This is important, right? Because if you guess it right, your 2X driver gets 20 additional points that you can secure for your team. So we're trying to get the right driver each and every week for this award. Ferrari won the first 4 across 3 different drivers. So we had a little parity to start the year. But then Lando Norris went on to win 6 of the next 7, including that race where he collided with Max at the end and didn't even finish. So, Rob, what's your take on the state of driver of the day? And do you think we're going to have more parity in the second half?
I think so. I don't think Lando Norris will fade into obscurity in the driver of the day all of a sudden. But I do think Mercedes, and particularly Lewis Hamilton, who's got 2 of the last 3, definitely becomes a viable alternative. I do still think Lando, in this race-winning car, in the kind of fantasy production we've seen from him this year, that he is the standout best 2X option. But I went with George Russell and Oscar Piastri in Spa, and as opposed to just going with Lando Norris, and that worked out perfectly fine. So I do think we're going to see a bit more deviation away from Lando Norris lineups into a more balanced 2 premium driver combination, just to cover off that driver of the day if Lando kind of loses his grip on that.
Terry, let me ask you, Max Verstappen has 7 wins to lead the grid by a long shot this year. What's he got to do to get a driver of the day in this game?
Probably change nationality. But I mean, interesting. There's a lot of negative media going on with Lando at the moment after his comments about Lewis. Certainly over here in the UK. I don't know if you guys are picking up on that as well. But there's been some old comments that resurfaced. There's been the comments in the cool down room. It'd be interesting to see if that makes a difference or not. We know Lando's got this huge fan base, and like I said, these comments are old comments resurfacing. But certainly during the summer break here, they've been picked up on quite a lot about the sort of disrespect to Lewis, and from 2023, and we had that instance in the cool room where he made the comments about the car. So it'd be interesting to see if the rise of Lewis in terms of performance and Mercedes, and a bit of negative media for Lando, whether or not it's going to have one effect where the fans will obviously come out and back him even more and bump that figure up, or actually will we see a shift in the voting for it?
And Lewis has taken 2 of the last 3 driver of the day with Piastri in the middle. So it's been a little bit since Lando's won the award, and maybe the fans have turned to try to get some fresh blood in winning the award. So hopefully we see some fresh faces and it doesn't get too stale like it did during that stretch of Norris dominance earlier in the season.
Yeah, interesting fact that Lewis's driver of the day was the first time a McLaren or a Ferrari driver had not won that since Sonoda in Abu Dhabi last year. And you have to go all the way back to Belgium of 2023 to see Max Verstappen, another non-McLaren or non-Ferrari, win that. So I think that's quite telling for what that could mean for the second half of the year for Lewis and the driver of the day vote.
I forgot about that Sonoda Abu Dhabi driver of the day. That was fantasy championship deciding, that sort of that play at the end. So it could really make a difference in both mini leagues and in the world tournament as well. So moving from Lando's dominance at driver of the day to Red Bull's dominance at the fastest pit stop, this is a category that they have crushed this year. They now have 125 points from fastest pit stops alone, including back-to-back races at Japan and China, where they posted all 3 fastest pit stops, and that 1.9 second stop for Max at China is the fastest stop of the year. So, Rob, is this enough to warrant having Red Bull as a regular asset on our team?
I mean, it's a tough one because, you and I have kind of gone down different routes with that approach the last few weeks. And they do have a stranglehold on that. They average, 8 to 9 points per race at this point of the season on pit stop points. And if it wasn't for Checo's shortcomings, I think there'd be a lot more Red Bull constructor in our teams. It's just his inconsistencies, his inability to crack Q3, and then obviously that hits the teamwork points that comes with the constructor. It has certainly dissuaded quite a few people just because of McLaren's and Mercedes' consistency on track, regardless of what happens in the pits. So the price is a challenging one, and I think that's what is probably driving me away from them at the moment.
It's a great point. And also, I had this aha moment a few weeks ago that if you have a one-stop race, you only have 2 bites at the apple at getting the fastest pit stop. So if you don't stick it on the first stop, you're going to lose those points. And that's been really holding Red Bull afloat during this time of struggle for Checo. And over these last few races, they've scored 5 or fewer points in 4 of the last 6 races for fastest pit stops. We've had the likes of VCarb, McLaren, and Alpine all nibble into those fastest pit stop points, which is really hurt if you're counting on Red Bull for them. So for me, I agree with you, Rob. This last race was, I think, the nail in the coffin for me that I've got to wait on Red Bull until Checo really turns things around.
I wonder if we end up seeing that at all with all that talk around his seat, which is probably a discussion for later in the show, but not something to ignore completely regardless.
Absolutely. And so now moving on to DNFs, we're looking right now at just Grand Prix DNFs and DNFs that were assigned the 20-point penalty in F1 Fantasy. So if you classified like some of these incidents that happened in the last few laps of a race that they didn't count in this data. So remarkably, Terry, you pointed this out to me off air, Oscar Piastri's completed every lap this season along with Fernando Alonso. How much longer do you think we can keep this up for?
I don't know. I mean, it's fatal, isn't it? Now that we've said it, probably something's going to happen in the Dutch Grand Prix next weekend, isn't it? When that happens. But no, it's pretty impressive. The reliability nowadays with the engines are, we're in year 3, year 4 of engine freeze now, so we don't get that we used to get years ago. So a lot of the stuff we're seeing from DNS is either a collision, contact, or just a faulty part gone wrong. We're not seeing that age old we used to see years ago with engines blown up. That should be coming back in 2026. Let's be honest, that'll be an exciting time then. But for the meantime, DNS are going to be based around, I think, a lot of on track contact and parts going wrong, rather than actual engines blowing up like we used to get, unfortunately. If you're a fan who likes that sort of thing.
You say exciting, Terry. Maybe exciting for the viewers, terrible for fantasy strategists. So I don't think I can do with another one.
It depends if you got me in your team or not, doesn't it, really? It's a bit like the George Russell incident, isn't it, in Hungary? So certainly there was a moment when you realised you didn't have George in your fantasy team and you're like, actually.
And Rob, you last year you had this really great research into how often it is that we have 2 drivers reach the end of the season and complete every race lap. And then Lando famously had his incident at Las Vegas that ended that streak. Do you have any bold predictions in the second half of which driver we'll see fall first?
I'm not gonna say anyone in particular because I earned the ire of many in the F1 fantasy community last season in Las Vegas. But I would be very surprised if we go the entire season and see Piastri and Alonso get through every single lap of the year. It's just, I think, the natural order of affairs in F1 that there's bound for something to go wrong. But I think looking into the second half of the year for DNFs, it's no surprise to me that Williams and Alpine drivers and constructors are at the top of the pile because their reliability deteriorates even more in the second half of the year. So I would tread carefully with the likes of Albon, Sargent, Gasly and Ocon as we kind of get into the latter stages of 2024.
And this is just a reminder of how important it is to correctly pick which drivers will finish the race, which takes a bit of luck to it because Ferrari, Williams, Haas, and Alpine all had double DNFs at some point this season, while Gasly, Ricciardo, and Perez had back-to-back DNFs. So it can be really painful if you stick with both drivers of the same team and you have an issue, or if you stick with the same driver for multiple races and they do it to you in back-to-back weeks. So we'll be sure to keep mixing up our lineups and hope we avoid the DNF bug. Moving on now to overtakes, and we're back to Kevin Magnussen and another category that he is dominating in. Rob, take us through the rise of Haas this year and how Magnussen's overtake abilities have contributed to his overall cost cap increase and his standings in the overall points table.
Yeah, I think it 100% boils down to how good that car has looked in the midfield. I think coming into the year, there was a little bit of skepticism around Ayo Komatsu, a bit of disunity or dysfunction in the team, and they definitely got on top of that tyre degradation concern that really plagued them a year ago. K-Mag in particular hasn't necessarily been the strongest qualifier, which for him as a driver, not great, but in F1 fantasy is the ideal mix of a good driver in a C-tier car that qualifies badly but can make up positions and overtakes in a race, and that's very much embodied in that 85 overtakes so far this year, and Hülkenberg kind of reaffirms that in third place. So Haas are a magnet for overtakes, and Zhou, who we thought coming into the year after a pretty good season last year in the overtake department, not quite where we expected to see him 12 months later.
Yeah, it seems like there are no true budget drivers at the very back of the grid that are dominating in overtakes, but luckily Haas is making up for it with a fantastic year. Terry, over to you. I would expect to see Sergio Perez getting a little bit more in the overtakes department, considering how many times he started outside the top 10. Can you summarize for us what's contributed to some of that inability for the RB20 to storm up the grid the way it did in previous years?
It's the car that doesn't like being in traffic. Simple as that. There's clearly sort of things with the cooling, and it's a car that doesn't like following cars. I mean, no Formula One car enjoys being in traffic, let's be honest about it. So they're designed to be in nice clear air, driving at the optimum. But some cars react very differently when they're stuck in this DRS train, and the Red Bull seems to be one of those cars which just does not like being stuck in traffic for a long periods of times. We've not seen what the RB19 had, where it used to come through the pack. It seems to have that extra boost on the DRS, which the other teams have caught on to this year. So Red Bull haven't got that advantage that we saw last year with the RB19. And that's played a big part in that, I think, in terms of, both Max coming back through the pack where he's been lower down, and also Checo getting even more places. I know there's been a few more DNS for obviously Checo as well, but I think that's really telling that the teams have obviously unlocked what that triple DRS that was talked about last year with Red Bull had in place. They've clearly got on top of that and reacted to that and mitigated that, and I think that's a big problem for Red Bull in terms of overtaking now.
And I definitely learned my lesson at Spa last time out. I was hoping with the Verstappen penalty, he would just rocket his way up the field, and it didn't quite happen the way we thought. They were 5th and 8th across the line before the Russell disqualification, so Red Bull clearly don't have that special sauce that they've had in previous years.
Yeah.
So let's chat a bit about chips. And so this data here is about the best time to use Limitless. And earlier this season, Rob and I suggested to all of you that you save this for a sprint weekend because you have 3 events to score points. And you can see here, in just 3 out of the 11 non-sprint races, there was a Limitless team with a higher score than one of the sprint races. Now, for 2 of those 3 races, you needed to run George Russell, who at the beginning of the season was the least selected driver in the game. So it's really unlikely that on a non-sprint weekend, you pick the right Limitless team to outscore a sprint weekend.
Yeah, I think as well, it very much tells us about using it in the first couple of sprint races of the season is the best time, because unless of course you're going differential and using it on a non-sprint weekend, but that's a conversation for another time entirely. I just think at the first kind of 4, 5, 6 races of the year, it's very evident to us who the best couple of teams are, and it just makes that decision picking the Limitless lineup that much easier. You look at where the kind of grid in the top half is kind of playing out right now. I couldn't tell you who's going to finish in the top 5 week to week. It's one week it's Mercedes, another week it's McLaren, another week it's Max Verstappen. It's just not as easy a decision. And even Ferrari, Leclerc again in Belgium most recently, they weren't really on the radar at all. So it's I think very much telling us that next year, the first 1 to 2 sprint races is again the best time for Limitless.
And you can see this footnote in the corner about the final fix chip because it's a very popular play in Spa. A lot of folks started Oscar Piastri and then final fixed in Verstappen to try to get the cost cap gain from Oscar and the points from Verstappen moving up the grid. Max ended up scoring just 5 more points, which ended up being 10 points with the 2x boost. And then Oscar only gained 0.1 million more than Max. So that chip might have been a loss for some people. Hopefully for the three of us that held on to our chip, we can make more use of it in the second half.
Definitely a creative approach to using it, but it's certainly more of an insurance policy if we see a driver not even start the race later in the year.
So now let's move on to some of the saddest moments of the first half of the year, starting with the Max DNF at Australia, which was his lowest score since the same race 2 years prior, and he lost a fantasy record 0.7 million in value. So that was probably one of the hardest hits that I can recall for Max in a long time. Rob, which of these was the most painful to you?
I think for me, it has to be Spa, and I'm probably in the minority there because I don't think that many people had George Russell and Mercedes. And I can't remember the year, but I think you'd have to go back more than 20 years to find the last time a race winner was disqualified after the race had concluded. And, you know, it looked at the time a great result for my team. I think I was on for halving my rank and one of the highest scores of the weekend, and then to have that pulled away from me was gut-wrenching. So that's probably been the hardest one for me to recover from, but I know a lot of people got hit pretty badly with the Haas drivers in Monaco as well.
Yeah, Rob, going back to that Spa incident, the provisional scores when Russell crossed the line in P1, he had the 25 points for P1, the 6 positions gained, which was then replaced by the 25-point disqualification penalty. So it was a 56-point swing from his provisional score to his final score, and that totally reshuffled the top 10,000. I think our ranks went all over the place as a result of that. Terry, what did you think of, like Rob mentioned a moment ago, the disaster or the disaster, as we called it, at Monaco with the double DQ and double DNF?
I thought we weren't going to talk about this, Adam. You know my feelings on this one. That was just, I've almost cried on that one, to the point where I actually transferred Haas out of my team at principal after that. I'm not sure if they're back in yet. They might have just snuck back in, which for the game probably wasn't the best move when we look at Magnussen's results, but he kind of had to go on that because I was a victim of the Max DNF and also the Haas ones as well. So yeah, certainly early season, that's a lot of lost points, which you look back now and go, actually, that would have made a massive difference to where the standings are for sure, definitely. So I'm glad that I escaped Belgium unscathed and actually positively based on what happened in Monaco.
And I think but it goes to show you that everyone gets a piece of some of these really bad issues, because for me, I had Charles Leclerc as my 2X driver and the Ferrari constructor at Canada, and that absolutely crushed my team. I think I had 46 points total on the week because of that minus 16 for the Ferrari constructor. So it seems like every major incident tangles up at least one of us at some point throughout the year. So if you get hit by one of these things, don't worry, all of us are getting impacted by them too. And speaking of just the many things that can happen over the course of the year, the meta, or has there even been a meta, Rob? It continues to shift week after week, and it's keeping us on our toes as we try to pick the best lineup every race.
Yeah, and I don't think that it's going to be the same meta by the end of the year either. We kick things off the first few races of the season where it was clear Red Bull and Ferrari were the teams to beat in F1 Fantasy, and then it's been very well documented, probably since about Miami or Imola that McLaren have been on the rise, and then Mercedes probably in the last 3, 4, 5 races have also entered the fray. So it's very much a recycling in terms of where we kind of gravitate towards in terms of drivers and constructors. I wouldn't be surprised if Ferrari, for example, popped back up on our team radars by the end of the season. Terry, have you got any kind of predictions on what could be the flavour of the month, 4 or 5 races into the second half of the season?
No, I mean, we're coming on to more of it in terms of updates and upgrades, but I think these 4 teams are still going to dominate at the top. I don't think there's going to be a surprise in the shift to someone joining them. Is what I'm predicting. I don't think we're going to see like a 15 gate crasher at all. And the ones who are on the outskirts, you got obviously VCarb, you've got Aston Martin, those sorts of teams. I don't think their development's going to be enough of a challenge to these 14. So I think we're still going to be in this cherry picking for, but I think you're absolutely right. They're going to change around. The other thing which we didn't sort of cover in terms of development was the calendars actually played a big part in that. The first few races were flyaway races, which we didn't see any updates to the teams at all. So whoever got it right to start off with had that lock-in for all the way up until around sort of Miami in terms of their dominance. And that's when we saw the first sort of changes around Miami, which was when the teams managed to get updates on the car, because for the first sort of 4 races, they didn't really bring much to it, only sort of track specific parts because of the way the calendar laid out, with obviously going to Japan quite early as well this year. So there was a bit in that as well, which made playing the chips earlier better and probably played a big part. And I know we've got a calendar change as well next year, haven't we, with obviously Australia opening as well. So it certainly might be something to forward plan for in terms of when updates arrive on the car.
That's a great point, Terry, and a great place to put a pin in it for the first half of our mid-year review. So join us next time as Terry breaks down the winners and losers from the technical arms race in the first half. We share our predictions for the rest of the season, and we have a very special announcement about the future of the game right here on the Fantasy Formula Mid-Season Review Part 2.